Hello there, everybody, and welcome to Things We Said Today, our weekly podcast/internet radio show in which we discuss virtually anything having to do with the Beatles, either their history or what's happening today. I'm Al Sussman from Beatle Fan Magazine, and I'm here with my three cohorts in three different areas of the country. Up in the great state of Connecticut, the host of the internet/terrestrial radio Beatles radio show, Every Little Thing, Ken Michaels.
Hi, Al. How's everyone doing?
Great, Ken. And out on the West Coast, the reporter for Beatles Examiner and in various other Examiner columns for Examiner.com, Steve Marinucci. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Al. Hello, everyone.
And up in the great state of Maine, our resident musicologist and classical music savant and longtime contributor to Beatle Fan Magazine as well, Allan Kozin.
Hey, Al, how are you doing?
Good, Alan.
Great.
Now, we're going to discuss something which, as Tom Francione said last week, is pretty much mind-blowing to him, and that is the 20th anniversary of the overall Beatles Anthology project. It was 20 years ago, actually last week, because Thanksgiving was a little bit early that year, but it was Thanksgiving week in 1995. That that ABC telecast the 6 hours in three parts of the Beatles Anthology, which included the world debuts of something that people, I think Beatle fans, didn't think they would ever be able to hear, and that was in effect new music by the Beatles. So it was a very special time, and then that was followed up by 3 2-disc sets of full of rarities and alternate takes and all kinds of things, followed up by a large coffee table book on the anthology, basically kind of a print version of the video, and then finally, well, not even finally, the videotape of the show, plus a good deal more material that was released in the fall of 1996, followed some years later, I think about 2003, Alan, is that correct?
The DVD, sure.
Yeah, by a DVD version, which had even more material. And plus, in at least some parts of it, 5.1 surround sound. So it's a major event with a capital E in the history of the Beatles, and certainly I did a piece for Beatle Fan Magazine in the fall of '96, in which I talked about how much fun this whole experience was, and it was something because I think probably Ken is going to disagree, but I think by the mid-'90s, a lot of us had become somewhat jaded as Beatle fans, and this gave us a whole new enthusiasm. So,
what do you mean by jaded?
I think it's hard to explain, but I think the average fan wasn't really all that excited by each new release as they had been some years before.
Oh, you mean the solo releases?
Well, yeah, by that point, because obviously until the Live at the BBC collection, there hadn't been any new group releases, especially new group releases, in a very long time, and the last few kind of archival releases, they weren't even archival, they were just compilations that came out in the late 70s and early 80s. There was less and less excitement with each one.
I would agree with you on that. Mm-hmm. Although where the solo music is concerned, the years leading up to it, you still had George's big comeback with Cloud 9 and the Traveling Wilburys. So, and you had Paul with Flowers in the Dirt and Off the Ground, leading into the BBC and the Beatles Anthology. But I think that his record sales were starting to taper at that point. Definitely, I will agree with you there.
Mm-hmm.
I think you nailed it when you said enthusiasm, because I think because there had been kind of a flat period before that, and and there had been rumors off and on that this was going to happen, and it never came about. And in fact, there were a couple of aborted. There was at least one aborted version, and so I mean, I don't know that anybody really thought this would eventually happen, especially after without John, but it did, and and thankfully it did. It came out, and thankfully they got it before George passed, and so I mean, I that's really good that they were finally able to get it together.
Yeah. Well, the novelty of the thematically driven compilations, rock and roll music, love songs, then real music, then 20 greatest hits. I think that really had worn off by then.
Oh,
so
yes.
And there was a long drought there between 20 greatest hits and Live at the BBC.
Right.
Right. And not only that, I mean, some of those, one of the reasons I think that we became jaded, as Al said, is that, 20 greatest hits had such, incredibly insightful programming as a truncated Hey Jude.
Yes.
Real music was also pretty much, I don't know, people thought of it as a bit of a waste of time. I mean, there was that medley, which was, it was okay, but no one, I don't think, really saw. This was in the pre-mashup days and everything.
Yes.
And no one saw the point of making a new medley of Beatles film songs. And I think we sort of were beginning to look at EMI as having really nothing much interesting to say. And in fact, the Beatles thought so too. I mean, they were at the time as well involved in what became ultimately a 20-year lawsuit from 69 to 89. And part of the settlement of that suit, the terms, the relatively few terms that leaked out, were that EMI could do nothing in terms of reissues and releases and compilations without the Beatles' approval. And at that point, way back then in 89, the only thing they were even considering approving were the Red and Blue albums, which eventually they put out in the early 90s. I think, in those days, I don't think they would have even considered something like One. I mean, their thinking evolved in different ways over the years. But, and I think also, we should probably look back a little bit at the history of what became the anthology, because it first came to anyone's attention in one of John's interviews. And I can't remember which. It probably was one of the ones towards the end of his life, either the BBC or the David Sheff interview, where he said, they're putting together a history of the Beatles. It'll no doubt be called Long and Winding Road.
Right.
And the Long and Winding Road, such as it was, recently came out on a bootleg, and we got to see what they were, what Neil Aspinall's first cut of it was. Which was really just a bunch of clips. And I think once they settled the 1989 lawsuit, without which there could have been no discussions of any archival stuff. In fact, the Sessions album, which was going to come out in about, I think, they were talking about it as early as 1983.
Right.
They had put that together. They had sent out tapes to various of the EMI territories, and the Beatles nixed it. And at EMI at the time thought, well, okay, actually we have the right to do this, but they didn't want to offend the Beatles. So when the Beatles nixed it, they just shelved it. And they nixed it really as a strategic move. It wasn't necessarily that they were against it, because pretty much everything on Sessions came out on Anthology.
Exactly. Right.
But they didn't want EMI. They didn't want to establish that precedent of EMI trawling through the archives and putting out stuff without the Beatles necessarily involved. So nothing like the BBC Sessions, anything could have come out before the 1989 settlement. That made everything possible. And that led to, I think, the revival of Long and Winding Road, which got its name changed partly because George, from everything I heard when I was reporting on it at the time, objected to it being named after one of Paul's songs. Why not have it named after? Yeah. I mean, it's not called I Me Mine either. Which
right.
I think his feeling was that it shouldn't be anybody's song. It should have a title of its own, and that's what eventually happened. And there was a lot of backstage politics about this, and they took a really long time to get everything together, to acquire film and video from television stations around the world, like in Paris, Sweden, all of those things. Apple didn't have that. I mean, they assembled a lot of their archive in the years that went into preparing for the anthology. So,
and the turning point was at that juncture, I think in 92 or 93 at I believe one of the award shows. When Yoko gave Paul the I guess cassette tapes at that point of the three songs, the three Lennon demos that became the Threedle sessions.
Right. Because actually until then, Paul and George mentioned a couple of times that they were working on this thing that wasn't yet being called the Beatles Anthology. So for years, we sort of knew that they were working on it. And what they talked about was, maybe we'll play some incidental music for it.
Right.
So everyone expected that, okay, we would have a little bit of Beatles studio jamming as the background music for this set. But even that would have seemed kind of interesting to me. I would have wanted to hear that without the documentary going over it too. Just hear what they did. So I think Yoko giving them the tracks sort of changed the approach of what they were thinking of doing.
Right.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, Bill King got a major exclusive when he found out about the certainly the Free as a Bird sessions. And in fact, Allan, if you recall, Bill got it into a Beatle Fan Extra. And in fact, it may have been the very first Beatle Fan Extra, which came out with packaged with a new issue of Beatle Fan. Yeah, and this was in February or March of '94. So that's how far back the excitement began to build. And certainly by the fall of '95, unless Allan, you've got some other detail.
It's funny because I thought I had that exclusively, and I'd have to look back and see.
Well, he may have credited you. I haven't read it.
I don't know. But I'd heard from a friend of all of us in England about what was going on with those sessions soon after they happened, and it was kind of funny in a newspaper world sort of way. I wrote this piece about that they were recording this song, that they had the sessions, and it was going to come out when they did their documentary. And for some reason, we had a copy editor who gave the piece the headline, "Will they or won't they? They will, it seems." Not mentioning.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God.
And so the piece was widely ignored, and Newsday, which was competing with us, this is when it was at the Times, actually called its classical music critic and said, "You have to follow this up. You have to do a piece about this." So he called me and said, "You wouldn't believe it. They're making me do something about Beatles piece, and what can you tell me?" I mean, he not only didn't want to report it, but he didn't really have the connections to report it, and we were friends, and I'd already written my piece, and so it didn't matter. So I just gave him a bunch of info, and he wrote a piece. That night on television news in New York, because their copy editor put the Beatles in the headline, and it caught someone's attention, television news said, "Newsday has exclusively."
Oh, no.
The Beatles are going to be recording again. I was so angry. But,
wow.
That's the world. That's what happens,
That's typical of this business.
It really is.
Yeah.
But, but it was exciting hearing about these things, and also that, the next year, I think that when they recorded the next one, all of these things were, everything was sort of building up to the anthology coming out and having these tracks, and, which they were really good about. I went to England to do interviews for a couple of pieces I was doing for the Times about the anthology, and they let me see the videos while I was there. And they were in a slightly different format from the American versions. They were 1 hour each. Mm-hmm. And they were also not finished. They had some things that were later changed. And no matter what I tried, though, I could not get them to let me hear Free as a Bird. I went to, strangely enough, a storyboard meeting with the video director when they were planning to do the video for Free as a Bird. So I kind of knew what the video was going to be, but had no idea what the song was going to sound like,
Wow.
So it was in a way it was exciting, and it was frustrating, and it was also kind of nice hearing it at the same time as everybody else.
Absolutely. Yeah. As a matter of fact, on the Friday morning before the first telecast, Scott Shannon on WPLJ in New York talked about the anthology, talked about the new songs, specifically Free as a Bird, but he said, I can't play the finished product because we don't have it. Mm-hmm. So what he did was he, from one of the various Lost Lennon tapes bootlegs, played what he figured was probably the demo that was used for the finished product. Mm-hmm. But that's all he could play. He wasn't, because they had been able to shield the finished product so well. In fact, Steve, you were in TV production at that time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what kind of efforts were you making to try to unearth all of this?
Well, I was more in the production of the TV coverage, I wasn't on the front line. I wasn't the one reviewing the tapes. Mm-hmm. We had another guy that was doing that. So I didn't really get to see anything beforehand. But I was getting all the publicity shots and the CD-ROMs that they sent out that are now, that are now well known as collector's items. But I was getting that stuff. And there were some video clips on the CD-ROMs that I got to see, but I didn't get to see the full thing beforehand. But we knew this was big because I remember we made it the cover of the TV magazine. I was the editor of that magazine, and so it was fun being able to put the Beatles, and we used the Let It Be pictures on our cover. And I can't remember what the headline was that I wrote, but it said Beatles definitely.
Mm-hmm.
But we got
I got the advanced cassettes from ABC TV as well. They came in a really nice binder, and they did not have Free as a Bird or Real Love in them. They only had the show. So,
wow.
So even, Steve, if you had managed to talk your reviewer into giving you the copy, it wouldn't have been there.
And do we need to explain to people what CD-ROMs are?
Well, it was kind of a burgeoning thing at that time. Mm-hmm. But I used to get CD-ROMs from a lot of different companies or different networks because they would have photographs on them that we could use to reproduce. It wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it was now, and everything is all digital now. We were still doing, I think, prints back then too. But in this case, they sent out CD-ROMs with digital photos of the Beatles from all different years. Mm-hmm. There was text on them. I can't remember what else was on them, but there was all sorts of stuff on them. And in fact, the one thing that was funny was, and Alan, you may remember this, they had time limitations on them. Do you remember that?
Yeah, vaguely.
They had calendar limitations that you only could play them the way they were set up in a certain time. Of course, they didn't lock the photos or anything, so even if you have a copy of them now, you can still get to the photos. But you can't, because they were all set up under earlier versions of QuickTime and everything like that, you couldn't play them for what they are, for the programming on them outside.
Well, I think you could go in and reset the clock on your computer to fool it into thinking that it was earlier than it was.
That's true too. You could still do that, but I mean, is it worth doing? That's kind of crazy. No, but yeah, I mean, that's what you would have to do to play it, to play it now, or to play it outside the time period. But they had, and I remember they had all these things about you couldn't use the pictures outside of the anthology. I mean, they do the same thing today. I mean, for some of the stuff some of the pictures that were set up for one had limitations on them like that too. But I think celebrities do that as a matter of course, just to kind of focus, the newspapers and the publicity in on when they, on what you're publicizing. But yeah, I mean, they did that too. So yeah, I mean, it was strange. But I remember sitting down like everybody else. I mean, I was on the couch that night watching Free as a Bird for the first time, like everybody else was, of course. But what was funny was that they managed to keep it out of the shops, and nobody. I mean, you realize if this had been now, it would have been way out of. It would have been all over the internet before the broadcast.
Mm-hmm. Well, not necessarily, because, for instance, there have been 2 or 3 recent examples of albums that were really kept under wraps. Beyonce's last album, this new Adele album, 25, they were kept under wraps until absolutely right as they were scheduled to be released.
Right, you're talking about now versus then. I mean, the
exactly.
Technology wasn't as advanced then as. I mean, I remember getting Beatles advanced CDs, for example, Yellow Submarine Songtrack. Mm. And Alan, you probably had one of these with your name on them. You have one of those? Yeah. I do too. I mean, that, to keep you from putting the tracks out on the internet. And, I mean, they do the, watermarking and all that stuff, which everybody does now. I mean, that's, but I mean, there was all sorts of things, to.
Hey, the worst example I saw was George's posthumous album. When you could finally talk them into giving you a copy, seeing as you had to review it in time for the review to hit just before it came out. So you needed to hear it, and there was no way around that. They sent it in a CD player, a portable CD player, which was glued shut.
Yes.
And the headphone was glued into the thing, so you couldn't even take a patch cord out of the headphone jack and copy it analog onto a computer. There was nothing you could do.
I never had that problem. I never got that. So wow,
that's amazing. Now, Ken, of course, you've been in radio for forever. And I believe.
Thank you. I'm a dinosaur, is what you're
exactly.
saying.
Exactly. And I think you were now. Were you at ABC Radio at that point?
I was working for an independent syndicator called Radio Today.
Yes, that was.
And it was still Radio Today then. We were bought out by ABC Disney in 1998. Right. So this was still Radio Today. But I was also on the air on B103 on Long Island, their oldie station, when the Beatles Anthology came out. And I did a bunch of specials on the Anthology too, mixed that in with everything else. So it was an exciting time, definitely. There's something that you brought up just before, Al, about the Lost Lennon tapes and the fact that, Free as a Bird aired there first. I think that for some Beatle fans, while it was certainly exciting to hear Free as a Bird, the Beatles version, as well as Real Love, which actually first was placed on the Imagine John Lennon soundtrack. Right. And actually before that, it was on the Lost Lennon tapes.
Yes.
So for a lot of fans, they knew those songs before the Beatle versions came out. And I'm wondering how many of them, to me, the version of Free as a Bird is kind of close to what I thought the Beatles version would sound like anyway. That's just my own personal opinion. Although I thought it was a really nice touch that Paul got to sing lead in the middle and then George got a lead So you actually had 3 Beatles on lead vocals on Free as a Bird. I thought that was great. That was one of the wonderful things about that recording. And Real Love is kind of close to what I thought it would be. So it must have been a different experience altogether for the fans that didn't know those early versions from the Lost Lennon tapes. So, yeah.
Yeah, as I said earlier, it was something that was completely unique in that I think most fans after John was murdered, had totally that seemed to eliminate any possibility of any kind of Beatles reunion of any kind, whether it was live or in the studio or whatever. So this was the first, and with the 2 songs, the only chance they would ever have to hear new Beatles music.
Right.
So yeah, if they were not familiar with those 2 songs from the Lost Lennon tapes, it was a completely new experience that that even even those of us who went all the way back to the 60s had not had since then. So in that vein, guys, what were since you weren't able to hear the song until you weren't able to hear Free as a Bird until that Sunday night, what were you imagining they would be like? Did you have any kind of sort of oral vision of what those 2 songs would be like?
I thought actually that the versions that came out were pretty close to what I envisioned.
Right.
Only I didn't know with Free as a Bird that Paul and George would get a lead vocal there. It could have been all John, but actually no, they had to clean up that middle bit that wasn't finished, the Whatever Happened To bit,
right?
Because that wasn't fully written, so they had to add more to that, and John hadn't sung. Whatever had to be finished, you needed someone else to do a lead vocal there.
Right.
So it really was kind of close to what I think Jeff Lynne said, or I'm not sure who said it, but the recording of Free as a Bird is what the Beatles would have sounded like in 1995 anyway. And I kind of agree. I think that is the sound. If they were together, if John was alive, obviously John's vocals would have sounded better on the recording, but that's close to what it would have been, I think.
I honestly didn't think that they would do as good a job as they did. I thought there would be more John on there than there was. So in that respect, I think they did a fantastic job.
Oh, in what way did you expect them to have more of John on there?
Well, I mean, I thought that they wouldn't change, add as much to it as they did.
Okay.
And in that respect, I think they did Jeff Lynne did a great job, and they all did a great job, I think, there. But yeah, I really didn't expect it was gonna. I mean, I can't remember. I'm pretty certain I had heard the demo, but I really didn't think. I when I sat there and listened to it, it was great to hear them singing again, because we didn't think that was going to happen.
Exactly.
And it was closure for everybody. I mean, that's the big thing. It was closure for us. It was closure for them. Certainly it was closure for them. And I'd love to at some point, and I'm sure it'll never happen, hear them say that, but it'll never happen. But yeah, I mean, that's really what was so great. And I'm sure, there were Beatle fans all over the world were crying their eyes out, just listening to that thing. It was just amazing. It really was.
There's one other thing. There's certain solo songs the Beatles have given us through the years where I'm sure many of us have said that could have been a Beatles record. Like John talked about Woman. That was his Beatles song on Double Fantasy. Yeah. Sometimes, when I heard Free as a Bird originally on the Lost Lennon tapes, it sounded like it could have been a Beatles song. There are just certain songs that they've done on their own that you could have envisioned the Beatles backing the songs up. Free as a Bird is one of those songs for me. I don't know about Real Love so much, but definitely Free as a Bird has that feel to me.
Perhaps.
Maybe it's the piano part, the chord progressions, whatever. For some reason, Free as a Bird sounds like it could have always been a Beatles recording.
Perhaps that's why that was the first one they did.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Allan, what were you kind of expecting going, because since obviously you had, by that time you were very familiar with the various demos of the song from the Lost Lennon tapes, and from there.
Yeah, knowing the demo, sort of you knew sort of what the song was, and my spies had told me that George's slide guitar would be prominent, but that was really all I knew. For me, it wasn't closure; it was sort of closure.
Really?
Yes.
It was what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that word.
Opening.
Kind of cut out.
Opening. I made it up.
Wow.
But you know what I mean. And what I mean by that is, because that record was, to me, so beautiful, the harmonies, the playing, what they did with that, piano and vocal demo. I mean, it was pretty spare. And what they did was they made a really beautiful texture out of it, and with all of those elements that make the Beatles. And to me, it just was, yet another, why can't you guys just get it together and keep being a band? Even if there's only three of you, I don't care. The music that you're making on this track just shows what you've got that so many other, continuing concerns don't have. Just put all the stuff aside and make some more records as the Threedles. I don't care. I think I liked it so much that I just sort of felt that I wish they could do more. And so yeah, it wasn't closure really, but for me.
Of course, later on, you heard the details of the sessions and saw the bits that were in the DVD version of the anthology, and you saw why it was probably only going to be those 2 or 3 songs, because there were obviously tensions even there, especially with Paul, as usual.
But there were always tensions.
Yeah, right.
Those tensions sort of lead to, if everybody is sort of happy in a group, probably it's not going to be that fascinating. There's these things, people play off each other, and sometimes the frustrations lead you to do things. I think most of us have been in bands. You know what it's like to have to deal with a drummer.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, or whatever, and it doesn't matter, because to me the finished product is really all that matters. I mean, the fact that they may have been fighting like cats and dogs during the White Album is kind of a historically interesting point, but the White Album is the White Album,
Yeah.
I'm gonna probably be in the minority, but I'm kind of glad they didn't finish Now and Then, because those first two cut, the Free as a Bird and Real Love are so great that if Now and Then had turned out to be anything less, it would have brought everything down a notch, and
would have been an anticlimax.
Yeah, and so I mean, as I know that every time the story comes up every few years about whether Paul mentioned, Paul I think was the last one to mention it, and people get all excited. Oh, they're going to put it out. No, please, we have what we have. Let's just leave it at that. Especially since we don't have George around, let's just leave it.
Well, I think that's why they didn't put it out. I think they had a really very high quality control standard, and I think they looked at what they were doing with it and just didn't think it was going to be as good, and that's why. So, I wasn't thinking of them just keeping on doing Lennon demos. I was thinking the three of them could, do some new stuff of their own.
Yeah. Well, despite what you had just said, Alan, there are a lot of fans out there that think that those 2 songs, that either they weren't well executed, they didn't like Jeff Lynne's production, it was all a mistake. You're going to get a lot of people with, negative feedback.
That's true.
Regarding those 2 songs, especially the ones that keep saying it's not part of the Beatles canon, and
as we said,
like we were talking about in the last show. Yeah.
I knew a music critic that felt that way. That the music critic at the, if he's probably listening to the show, at the paper that I worked for, got into it with me and thought it was, thought Free as a Bird was terrible because of the fact that, it shouldn't have been done. And I of course had to disagree with him, but I mean, I'm sure there were other people, probably more not real. I think the real diehard fans basically felt pretty happy about it, but I'm sure there were a lot of people, like Ken said, that also felt that they shouldn't have done it, and I mean, I think that's kind of unfair, actually, because they did such a great job with it.
There were people at the time who were sort of, maybe not part of Beatle fandom, but certainly more of the mass media, mass population, who were saying, well, it's nothing more than Hank Williams being reunited with Hank Williams Jr. on a record, the same kind of thing. It's just electronic, digital hocus pocus.
Natalie Cole was somebody else that they mentioned.
Exactly. Because especially since her Grammy Award-winning performance of Duet with her father on Unforgettable was only a couple of years before the Anthology project came to light.
Yeah, but there's a big difference there, because when you're dealing with the Nat King Cole and the Hank Williams, you've got professional recordings being mixed together.
Exactly.
And Jeff Lynne had to work miracles with a mono cassette recording with hiss on it, from John at the Dakota. And so I think he worked wonders with it.
Yeah.
But you're always going to have that issue with Beatle fans that it's best to leave well enough alone. And even if the three of them had reunited, and to some of us it would have been fascinating, there'll always be so many people that the expectations will be so great you can never meet those expectations.
Sure.
Some people will be disappointed automatically. And so there are those that feel that better leave while you're on top, leave people wanting more, which is part of the Beatles' appeal.
Right.
The fact that, they ended when they did.
Right.
So,
well,
that's something that we never talk about here.
They didn't have to do it under the Beatles name. They could have come up with a new name and just had, for what I'm saying really is not that they should have continued being the Beatles without John, just that the chemistry between the three surviving Beatles that you can hear on those records, those two recordings, was so great that whatever they called themselves, they could have probably put out some really good music continuing on. That's just well I feel.
Yeah, well, Paul and Ringo still did a lot of work together. It's just Paul and George didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Now, in the fall of '95, there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of media coverage of the upcoming telecast of the anthology. ABC, of course, had a lot invested, both in terms of money and in terms of potential ratings, and they promoted it to the hilt, even to the point of calling themselves A Beatles C, in a nod to W.A. Beatles C back in the '60s. And it all came down to that Sunday night, November 19th, if I remember the date correctly, 1995, and especially the last few minutes, over the credits for the first installment. There's a performance of the Beatles doing "You Can't Do That" in Australia, and underneath. For those who never saw the original telecast, underneath there was a countdown clock. Now at that point, I'm 46. Do the math. You know how old I am. So I'm 46, and I'm watching this countdown clock, and my heart is going, like as if I was a 15-year-old. Waiting for W.A. Beatles C to debut a new Beatles record. It was just an amazing experience.
Yeah.
It was. What was it like for you guys?
Same.
I mean, my eyes were watering. It was like I said, it was I go back to that closure thing that it was. That's what it was for me, and my eyes were watering. I got really emotional over that. So.
It was exciting for me. I didn't look at it as closure. I didn't think there needed to be closure. But no, it was incredible. What I remember most of all, at least initially, about the telecast is the "Free as a Bird" video. because my wife, well, my future wife and I were sitting hand in hand waiting for that moment with the clock ticking. And the video is possibly the most amazing video I think I've ever seen. And it's not just because it's the Beatles, it's all the work that was poured into that video.
Oh, yeah.
And it was so tastefully done, especially at the very beginning. I mean, your anticipation is so high. And then the song doesn't even start until you're waiting for the bird's wings or flapping. So you're still thinking, where's the song? Where's the song? Where's the song? But the way that it started with the camera panning in that room to the childhood photos of each of the four Beatles, and then you had all these references to Beatles songs, so well crafted in this video, and people trying to figure out every single song that's in there, and did they get all of them? You've got newspaper taxis here and piggies here, and there's so much work that was poured into that video. And as much as I loved watching the anthology, that first telecast, all I could think about after the end was, I got to watch the Free as a Bird video again.
Yeah.
It's just that was so powerful, that video. It's just amazing, all the work that was poured into that video. It really is a work of art.
Yeah.
In fact, I just want to say one thing, because Jeff Lynne just released a new album with it's called Jeff Lynne's ELO.
Right.
But the single When I Was a Boy was released, and there was a video that was made. And if you watch that video, it's reminiscent of Free as a Bird, stylistically.
Really?
And also, let's face it, Jeff Lynne produced the song, Free as a Bird. So it's very similar stylistically if you watch that video. Anyone, if you can, go to YouTube or whatever and watch it and tell me if it doesn't remind you somewhat of Free as a Bird.
It's very interesting. Very interesting. In fact, Jeff Lynne's ELO just played in the New York area over this past weekend, if I'm remembering correctly. Right.
Irving Plaza.
Yeah.
Irving Plaza.
Right. Yeah.
Wish I could have gone.
Yeah.
I wasn't there. Yeah.
Me too, but I'm far away now. But now the next sort of chain in this link is the fact that it had been arranged in those days. Tuesday was generally the new release day for any, not only just major releases, but virtually any releases of both records and videos. But it had been arranged that the first of the 3 2-disc Beatles anthology sets would be released the next day, that Monday. And there were a lot of record stores that opened up at midnight. So there were probably some people who didn't actually see Free as a Bird because they had put them on videotape in those days, and were waiting online at record stores to get the first of the 3 2-disc sets. Now, I imagine, let's see. Now, Alan, had you gotten, I guess, a truncated version of?
No. I don't believe I had. I probably got it the next morning. I really can't remember, because going out at midnight and standing online was actually something I used to do for remember when Pepper came out on CD and some of the others. So, but I know that I sat in front of the TV. So obviously, I'm not sure what time it was over. Do you remember?
It was 11. It was 11.
Okay, so I could have made it down to Tower at midnight.
Yes,
so
right.
I might well have done that.
I remember going to Borders because I have a T-shirt that they gave away that night. And I still have.
I remember the one. Yeah.
So yeah, I remember I went to Borders, and Borders had they were giving away little prizes. I don't think they were giving away CDs, but they gave away gave away things, and they had T-shirts and stuff. And so yeah, they had a big promotion for that. I remember.
Ken, how about you?
I'm sure I would have bought it the next day.
Okay.
I wouldn't have. I don't think I went out at midnight locally, but I'm sure the next day I would have picked it up.
Yeah. Right.
While having Free as a Bird in my head all night.
Yeah.
Right. Sure.
Exactly. In fact, even the 2-disc set, there had been no leaks at all. I think I think the only sort of quote unquote leaks would have been people playing from bootlegs songs that were reputed to be on the on the set, but not the actual finished products. The obvious question is, what did you guys think of the first set?
I wasn't crazy about the narration being included. I could see why they did it, but I thought, I wish this were just the music without the narration. And after the first, they dropped it. I think a lot of people must have felt that way. But I mean, yeah, there were great things on there. I mean, having collected everything that you could collect in bootlegs, I thought I had heard an awful lot of stuff, but I was very happy to hear things like, the version of That'll Be the Yes, and In Spite of All the Danger. I mean, we heard snippets of them the first night on the documentary, but and then there were some things that we had always had, like Decca tapes and the Tony Sheridan things. But then it got into some outtakes, and those were really fun. I'm just sort of looking at the list of how far they went on that first one. It was a little bit of a kick having the demo and complete version of I'll Be Back, which were an outtake of Mr. Moonlight, which, by then was sort of high on the list of, as we've talked about before, of unfavorite songs. But nevertheless, I mean, it's good hearing a different one. Leave My Kitten Alone, we all had been, we all had somewhat less high quality copies. Sure. But that was one of those tracks that people had known about since the early 80s, and finally was bootlegged in about 84, but that was something that I think everybody was eager to have in the official catalog eventually. So, and then those 8 days a week. I mean, the version of 8 days a week on Anthology, I just love. I'm very happy with the decision they made to use the one that was the finished version, but I loved hearing the experimentation that they were doing with that song. It was another one of those things where, getting to peek into the Beatles sessions and hearing versions that were completely different from what they released, you sort of got the feeling that, they had so many good ideas. If it was 2015, every single one of those would have come out. People now release a track with 18 different versions and remixes.
Sure.
So sort of wonder if, if they had put 8 days a week out as a single initially, which in England, of course, they didn't, but if it would have come with some of these different versions, if it were today's kind of record industry.
Of course, you also have something like what to do, which you can kind of see why that wasn't included on Beatles for Sale or Beatles 65.
Right. Yeah.
Well, kind of like I said, the Beatles had a great ear for what their best material was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Except the way they treated George at the end.
Yeah.
With all the stuff that wound up on All Things Must Pass that they didn't release themselves.
Yeah,
so.
That's true. Yeah, Ken, what did you think of the first set?
I liked it a lot. I think overall, Volume 2 is probably the most interesting of the three of them. But what fascinates me the most in any of these three volumes would have to be when you've got different arrangements of Beatles songs or earlier versions, and you hear bits that didn't work out, or bits that were not included in the finished product, like And I Love Her, without having the 4-note guitar intro. And the middle bit, A Love Like Ours Will Never Die, that was not in that version.
Right.
Or hearing I'll Be Back in 3/4 time, which definitely did not work out.
Right.
Where I think it suffers, and this is just me being very greedy here, I'm not a big lover of doing things piecemeal. So to have 5 of the Decca Edition songs of the 15 To me, all 15, because historically it's all so important, I'd love to have that come out as one disc by itself. How do you pick 5 out of 15? Which are the best? Same thing later on with the White Album demos. How do you pick which ones deserve to be on there? I'm sure that those of us who know all the White Album demos would think, Revolution should have been on there, or something else that wasn't included. So, and what do you pick from the Tony Sheridan recordings? Or should you pick any at all? Is that the same category as the Fab Four? How much do you put in of the 1960 Quarrymen rehearsals? I love that stuff. You'll Be Mine, is that one of the best recordings of all of them? I don't know. But, when you do things piecemeal like that, it leaves me wanting more. And it makes me want the entire list of songs for each one to come out individually as a CD, which I think certainly with the deck of stuff and the White Album demos, it deserves.
Absolutely.
But it's also, it is interesting to hear You'll Know What to Do, just because for so many years we heard about that song. And, it's a decent song. It's not great. You can tell it's weaker than anything that George released of the songs that he wrote as a Beatle. Very
true.
But it still is interesting to hear that. Same thing with later on with If You've Got Trouble, which is a fairly weak song, but it's nice, nice to hear even their weaker stuff and to know why they didn't make the cut.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Steve?
I'm really mixed on the first volume because I think they, like you said, the talking kind of ruined the the pace of it. And I'm glad they changed that. But I'm glad they put Leave My Kitten Alone. I'm glad they put the Sweden tracks, which was a good show. The one thing that I think I'm glad that everybody finally got to hear was How Do You Do It. I'm glad they threw that on there. They also, I'm just looking in here, I forgot they had thrown on the Love Me Do with Pete Best.
Right.
Which when we were talking about Love Me Do and Andy White and Ringo, we forgot about that, and that's kind of been forgotten now. But this is where you get it. But I think I'm glad that they put it together. I think overall there was some talk that at one point they were considering a 6 CD set instead of doing this separately.
Right.
I think that would have been. I kind of think that would have been a good idea. Actually, they could have done 3 6 CD sets, and
exactly.
I would have been happy. But. Yeah, because 2 just doesn't seem like enough, and what Ken said about piecemeal really comes into play when you get some of the stuff that's in here. I was listening to the iTunes Anthology highlights the other day, and some of those tracks you just kind of go, "Ooh, wow, why did they pick that?" There are some things that you really wonder why they did what they did and why they didn't do other things. But you can't.
For instance.
Well, the Yes It Is, the way they cut that up and did the piecemeal thing on the third volume, which really irritated. I know that got a lot of comment at the time, and it's something that I've never really adjusted to, especially since the 2 takes were out there. I mean, they were in bootleg land. Why not just put them out? Why do something like that? It doesn't make any sense. But I mean, it's nice that they've done that. I don't know that that's ever going to happen again. I think people keep waiting for something like that to happen, and I don't think we're ever going to see that again. Oh well.
I think we may see the Decca audition come out, and we may see the White Album demos. Although, the reason that these White Album demos, not that they probably would have in any case done them all, because it would have put too much focus on one part of the story when they had 2 discs for the certain period of years. But they used the White Album demos that they did because that was all that George gave them. He had the stereo originals. All the stuff we had was mono from Lost Lennon tapes, which is sort of what Yoko had available in her archive. But George had the real high quality stereo recordings, and he chose them and told them that was all he had. And I am hoping that one day Danny will be rummaging through the archives and say, "Oh, here's the whole reel. Let's put it out." Because a lot of people would love that. I mean, that those demos as a whole are just great, and it showed again how creative they were at that time. They'd come back from India and they had 28 new songs, not all of which ended up on the 30-track White album. Just an explosion of songwriting there. So,
well, the other day I slipped onto my iPhone the Christmas album, and the fact that we don't have that, especially at this time of year, is, I think, a tragedy. It really should be out there.
Maybe not a tragedy, but it is kind of silly that they haven't. They could put it out so easily.
Right.
Right. I mean, they even have I have a legitimate, LP version of it from the fan club from 1971.
Right.
So it wouldn't take a whole lot of effort for them to put them out, even with a few outtakes.
Yeah, and at this point, there's quite a lot of outtakes available, and not to mention that the version that we have of Christmas Time Is Here Again, which is 6 or 7 minutes, is really all from this so-called EMI boardroom tape, where they're just playing a tape for EMI executives, and someone is recording it with an open mic. So, except for the little bits that were on the anthology singles, which is yet another aspect of this anthology thing.
Yes.
Put out some singles with some tracks that weren't on the thing. We have some snippets of Christmas Time Is Here Again from there, but, they've got the studio quality version they could be putting out.
Yeah. Right. Very true. Yeah. Again, this is something that is kind of outdated now, but back 20 years ago, there was a very popular thing called CD singles, and they were basically an outgrowth of the old vinyl 45s, and in a lot of cases, and certainly Paul McCartney made great use of this. There would be there would be bonus tracks, sometimes multiple bonus tracks that had not appeared anywhere else, and that was done again in the case of the CD singles of both Free as a Bird and Real Love, including, as Alan just said, that version of Christmas Time Is Here Again.
Right.
That was the kind of precursor to Ringo doing that song on his Christmas album.
Right.
Yeah. Something else that we were talking about before we began recording was the fact that, one of the things that makes it so amazing that this was 20 years ago is that both in the telecast of the anthology, of the original broadcast version of the anthology, and then in the video cassette version, and then in the DVD version, because of the fact that this was through Apple and it was the authorized version, we got to see what we perceived at that time to be master quality video from Let It Be, from the Beatles at Shea Stadium. And I can remember how great that material looked at that point. And then now we have some of that same footage on the OnePlus set, and it looks that much better than it looked 20 years ago.
Right.
This.
Well, I'm sure most of us thought as soon as we saw that Let It Be footage, Let It Be's coming out soon.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And that was
20 years ago.
20 years ago.
We're still waiting.
And we're still waiting. Any thoughts on the second and third anthology sets that continued the kind of the link of this whole chain of events connected with the anthology project?
I think pretty much what we said about the first, except that, with the later ones, and the second one, I think Ken was right, is the most interesting, and yet it had its frustrations too, because, outtakes became a different thing in that period. I mean, there weren't. Yeah, whereas with the early tracks, you would have them start a song and it would break down, or they would take a new approach, and so you had actual sort of discrete outtakes. With the Pepper sessions, for instance, that are on that second set, it wasn't so much that there were, 5 different takes of this song as there are different things on the multi-tracks that they used or didn't use, and so they could make an outtake out of stuff that we hadn't heard that was on a multi-track or something. It wasn't pure outtakes in the same way that the early ones were. And so you had a little bit of a sense of this being, it's nice to have something new, no question about that, but you still wonder what all the raw session tapes sounded like,
That's a really good point there, Alan. For me, the most fascinating part of all these 3 discs, and these are my 2 favorite recordings, are take 1 of Tomorrow Never Knows and take 1 of Got to Get You Into My Life. Both of them, I think, are back-to-back on Volume 2. Right. And just to hear what they sounded like in the very beginning. And Tomorrow Never Knows is interesting because it's slower. It's still spacier. I'm not spacey. It's kind of interesting. How did it get from that point to, what became Tomorrow Never Knows?
Yeah.
And Got to Get You Into My Life, a song that is so strongly associated with brass, to hear that without brass.
Yeah.
And to also hear it with that middle bit, with the I Need Your Love bit, which they eventually took out. That I found to be really fascinating. It's so bare, that version, and it's fascinating to hear that way. And, I totally agree with what you said there, Alan, although there's certain things, like there's a different take of Fool on the Hill, which I think is wonderful.
Right.
On Volume 2. There's a lot of good stuff on there.
Across the Universe is really a beautiful version. And since you mentioned, the Got to Get You Into My Life and Tomorrow Never Knows, the one track right after it is that And Your Bird Can Sing, which is a hoot where they're cracking up.
Right.
That was a lot of fun to hear, I thought.
Yeah.
How did you guys feel about just the backing tracks, the instrumentation behind just hearing Eleanor Rigby and just hearing Within You Without You?
I thought those were gorgeous.
Yeah.
Absolutely gorgeous. The Within You Without You one particularly gave me like a whole new appreciation for that song.
Well, that's the thing about all these recordings. I used to be, when I first started out, and I know you might remember me from my early days, Al, but I was very anti-bootleg. I was anti-bootleg back then. But
What was wrong with you?
Yeah, really.
You got better.
Well, I changed. I've done a 180 since then, but certainly the anthology gives you good reason for exploring all these different takes to understand how the songs finished up the way they did, and makes you realize how much more work was put behind these songs. And it could be something as simple like what we just said, Within You Without You, hearing just the instrumentation, that alone, and hearing how gorgeous that sounds, all the work put behind that. So when you hear different takes and different mixes, that can help to give you an entirely new appreciation. A few years ago, there was a bootleg that came out that had songs from Help and Rubber Soul, but the main difference was that the vocals weren't double-tracked. And you would think that something like that wouldn't make that big a difference, but it did. It made the song sound much more live, like you were right there in the studio, and it made you realize how much double-tracking did to vocals. Yeah. So just something that simple alone, that little technique, made a huge difference in those Beatle recordings. So anytime you hear anything slightly different in a Beatles recording, you can find something there that you never heard before. I guess that applies to most music, but the Beatles Anthology, and certainly you have to point to Strawberry Fields Forever and the different takes that they presented here. I think it was edited just right, just going from the acoustic demo to all of take 7, which is interesting to hear, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's just they did everything just right with how they presented Strawberry Fields. I loved take 1 too. That's haunting in and of itself, the way that it first started.
Yeah, very much so. In fact, as Alan knows, there was a complete album, bootleg album, of basically the entire chronology of Strawberry Fields Forever.
Right.
And so, I think this was, as you say, Ken, I think they struck just the right balance in kind of doing, in a sense, the highlights of that whole chronology.
Except in take one, as we had already heard when the tapes of the Abbey Road video session, when they closed Abbey Road and had people come in and watch a little historical presentation, and also some other tapes that had leaked out, there was a version of take one different from the one presented on the anthology, in that in the last verse there were vocal harmonies, and in the anthology they chose, for whatever reason, not to include those vocal harmonies, and I can't figure out why, because they're just beautiful. And but they're not in that version, so one of the big mysteries. So and again, so here the anthology, yes, here it is, it's officially released, but it doesn't sort of close the book on the bootlegs.
Yeah, very much so. Steve, let me ask you this.
Yes.
Now, the third anthology set, even though it did go to number one, all three sets went to number one on the at least on Billboard's album chart. Even though it went to number one, it was kind of perceived by some people to be a disappointment, partly because of the fact that there was no new song on that one, and partly because, I don't know, maybe people were disappointed in the material. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it's hard for me to really evaluate it completely, because most people, like a lot of people, I mean, I picked up a lot of the bootlegs in those days, so a lot of the stuff was familiar to me, like Not Guilty and things like that. Taking the outtakes out of context really isn't the same as sitting there listening to the takes back to back to back to back, like on Unsurpassed Masters, on those. I have to say, I think that spoiled me an awful lot. I mean, and again, the manipulating they did with the outtakes didn't please me a whole lot.
All right, Good Night, I guess, is probably the most obvious one on the third volume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing just bothers me, and I just didn't appreciate it. I mean, I'm glad they did all this stuff, and there are a lot of things that we didn't hear. For example, the While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which we actually had heard, but finally everybody else got to hear it. So I mean, there are some masterpieces on here, but the manipulating of the outtakes just is really irritating.
Mm-hmm. Was there enough of the Get Back material? Was there too much of the Get Back material?
They really didn't put that much on there. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah,
they sort of did.
I'm looking through the track list further down on the track list now. Yeah.
Nice hearing All Things Must Pass.
Mm-hmm. Right. I still wish, that's another thing. I still wish they'd put out the real Get Back album, but it's out there if you want it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is, there's some good stuff on here.
The version of Long and Winding Road, that is the take that Phil Spector used, but without all of the orchestration and all.
And like Alan likes Life with the Lions. I like What's the News, Mary Jane. I love that. Yeah, always have.
To each his own.
I say nay on that one too.
Yeah, definitely. Now there was, of course, a coffee table book and a video cassette release in the fall of '96, and as we mentioned a few years later, a DVD release. And we can save that until another time, because this hour plus has flown by. This is a really fun discussion of what I remember as a very fun event, series of events, if you will, for Beatle fans, the entire Beatles Anthology project. And let's see, Steve, if folks want to get in touch with us, how do they do that?
We have a Facebook page, Things We Said Today. We actually have two Facebook pages. There's a group and a radio station page. You can email us at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this show or any of the other shows that we've done. Or you can follow us on Twitter at thingswesaidfab. Mm-hmm. And you can also contact us individually. And I've gotten a couple of notes individually from people. We all have individual email addresses. Mine is BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. Everybody can kind of give theirs, but yeah, you can get a hold of us that way too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Allan, Ken, anything you two need to promote?
Just my website, which is kenmichaelsradio.com. There's lots of interviews on the website with people connected to the Beatles. In fact, a recent guest of ours, Kit O'Toole, you'll find a new interview with her on the website. And also there's my email address, which is everylittlething@att.net, and my Facebook page at Ken Michaels.
Okay, Allan?
Okay, well, you can look for my earlier of my two Beatles books, which is now called The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop, and originally came out around the same time as the anthology. And otherwise, you can contact me through Facebook at either Allan Kozinn or Allan Kozinn Remixed, or by email at allankozinn@gmail.com.
Okay, and since we just passed the 52nd anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy, I probably should do the classless thing and promote Change in Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation, which takes a look at the period from November 22nd, 1963 through March 1st, 1964, that included the Kennedy assassination, the breakthrough of the Beatles in America, and a whole lot more. And that can be obtained at Amazon.com or through www.paradingpress.com, and you can get in touch with me through there and through www.beatlefan.com, at Facebook at Al Sussman, and on Twitter at ASUSS49. And this has been, as I said, a fun hour and some distance. So for Steve Marinucci and Ken Michaels and Allan Kozinn, this is Al Sussman, and we will see you next time.